Thanks, Tricia. And since I'm friends with both Steve and Ol, I'm going to be declaring a truce between you two guys. So just to begin with a bit of a historical perspective and kind of a reminder that the carb-to-insulin ratio has been with us for a while. So this is actually from Jolson's textbook in 1935. So put it in historical perspective. This is 12 to 13 years after insulin was first introduced. And one of the questions he poses there is, how many grams of carbohydrate will one unit metabolize? This question no one can answer. There are always adjustments required for exercise and diet. And what I'm going to show you is 85 plus years later, we really don't have the answer to this question anyway. So as you know, I mean, the current approach now is, as Earl was just mentioning, what's become popularized over the last 15, 20 years is mealtime insulin boluses. And this is the formula which is probably familiar to most of you, which is sort of the standard of care when it comes to calculating insulin doses, carb counting. You take your carb quantity, your insulin to carb ratio, and out pops the dose. And what no one really discusses is the fact is that although this is sort of the standard teaching, what everyone is told to actually follow, it's never actually been scientifically validated. So, and what I'm going to show you is actually the data indicates that it actually really is not that reliable or accurate. And there are a number of different assumptions and limitations in this. I mean, I think one of the biggest, I think, challenges here is that the assumption that one can carb count with any accuracy, which I think is a difficult feat for most people anyway. One of the other big challenges related to using this whole approach, and something that I'm going to show you data around, is the assumption here is that the only ingredient in your food that actually affects your glucose levels is carbohydrate. And as I'm going to show you, there's a lot of emerging data showing that other factors, in particular fat and protein, are also factors at play. So in fact, what really got me interested in the whole question of how we bolus insulin at mealtime and the limitations of the current approaches was the introduction of CGM. And this is an old tracing. This is the old Medtronic CGMS. So this was the retrospective device which people wore for 3 days, and then you downloaded it and could look at the data. So what I pulled up here is the breakfast profile for someone after Cheerios. So as I mentioned, their glycemic index of 83. So what that means by definition is that 83% of the glucose load when the Cheerios is digested is absorbed in the first 2 hours. And you can see the fundamental challenge there is that this carbohydrate is extremely rapidly absorbed, but if you look on the top here, the insulin pharmacodynamics, so this is actually insulin action. This is not insulin levels, which will appear to be a lot quicker. The fundamental problem you're seeing here is there's this mismatch. The carbohydrates are absorbed much more quickly than the insulin kicks in. So that in practice, it's impossibly difficult, even if you get the absolute dose correct, to actually blunt the glucose profile there, unless you're going to play around with the dose timing and take the insulin earlier. But even with that, it's hugely challenging. And you can see what's happening in this late morning period. Most of the carbohydrates are being absorbed, the insulin is still kicking, and this person goes low. So in practice, really, when it comes to a lot of meals and carbohydrates, the only way to actually blunt the postprandials is illustrated here. This is steel-cut oatmeal, is really to change the carbohydrate type. So I think this sort of highlights just mashing insulin to carbs without focusing on the actual quality of the carb and the carb type is not in of itself going to be an answer to kind of getting the post-meal glucoses into range. Now, I think the broader challenge is really the fact that I think it's impossibly difficult to carb count. And this is just from a study we did actually at the Jolson. So this is people who'd been through the pump training program, who'd been through nutrition classes, a large apple, 30 grams of carbohydrate. And what you can see shown here is people's estimation of, of what they think the quantity of carbs is versus their A1C. And as you can see, really no relationship. And I think what this sort of speaks to in my mind is that a lot of people know how many units they need for a large apple. They may not know how many grams of carbohydrate in a large apple. And in a sense, most people, when it comes to dosing their insulin over time, just learn by experience based on their common foods and how much insulin they need. They get a hang of how to dose appropriately. What got me really interested in the subject I'm going to be talking about today, which is the effect of fat, was profiles like this. So you can see this is someone with steak and fries in the evening, and look what happens overnight. The glucose is going way, way, way high. And looking at carb counting, I mean, this doesn't give any explanation to what's happening here, because you can see the glucoses it's in the late overnight period that the glucose is going up. So there's no real explanation based on carbohydrates when it comes to trying to make sense of profiles like this. Well, if you look in the literature, there's actually a lot of data showing that fats and their breakdown products, free fatty acids, can actually affect glucose metabolism in the body. So this is some work which was done now 20 years ago, and a lot of this interest in this area about the way free fatty acids, the breakdown products of fat, affects insulin sensitivity actually relates to research in the type 2 diabetes field. Because people with type 2 diabetes, people with central obesity have high free fatty acid levels, and there's a lot of interest about whether these high free fatty acid levels could be the cause of the insulin resistance that people with type 2 diabetes develop. So this was a study specifically looking at this issue as it relates to people with type 2 diabetes. You can see in this top panel FFAs, free fatty acid levels. These open circles indicate this is an experimental process with infusion of intralipid, where they pushed up these individuals' free fatty acid levels. And in the bottom panel, what they did is shown here, is they did what's called a glucose clamp. So glucose clamp is the standard technique for assessing insulin sensitivity in research. And what you can see here, if you look at the open circles in the bottom panel, is about 2 hours after the free fatty acid levels went up, the glucose infusion rate, as shown here, started dropping off. So a reduction in the glucose infusion rate indicates that the free fatty acids are causing insulin resistance. So that's part of the physiology that may explain what I'd shown you in the previous slide there around why one sees clinically that these high glucose is after high-fat meals. The other factor at play, and this also has some relevance in terms of management of type 1 diabetes, is that fat can affect the rate of emptying of your stomach. So this is a study done in adolescents with type 1 diabetes, and what they did for this particular study, one experimental approach for assessing stomach emptying is actually to measure paracetamol, that's acetaminophen, Tylenol levels in the blood, because Tylenol is absorbed in the duodenum. That's the first part of the intestine after the stomach. So when the stomach empties, paracetamol, Tylenol will appear in the circulation. That gives you an indicator of the rate at which the stomach is emptying. And you can see in this particular study, so these kids were given identical meals with identical glucose loads. With a high-fat meal, you can see which is shown here in the triangles, paracetamol levels went up much more slowly than with the low-fat meal. And the next slide shows you the glucose levels so with these two meals. So these kids got identical glucose loads, and you can see following the high-fat meal with the triangles, the absorption of the glucose into the bloodstream was quite a bit delayed compared to the low-fat meal. So the implication for someone with diabetes taking insulin here, obviously, is if you're taking a higher fat meal, the stomach is going to be emptying more slowly. And if your glucose is in range at the time of the meal, and you take a full bolus of, say, Novolog or Humalog, what's going to happen is that the insulin is going to kick in before the carbohydrates get absorbed. And this is a scenario, I don't know if any of you have experienced, where you get a hypo early into the meal simply because the insulin is kicked in and the carbs haven't yet been digested and absorbed, partly related to the effect of fat delaying stomach emptying. So this is part of the physiology or the biology of the way dietary fat can impact on one's glucose control. And what we were interested in doing is really seeing whether we could directly tease out the effect of fat on people's insulin requirements in type 1 diabetes. So to do this study, we used the closed loop. So we had patients with type 1 diabetes who we brought into the clinical research center in the hospital. and put them on the closed-loop system. And what we did here was we completely controlled food intake, so we could see what the direct effect, particularly in this study, of fat was on people's insulin requirements. So what you can see is shown, what you can see here experimentally, so this is what was referred to as a crossover design. There was 2 periods of closed-loop control, 6 p.m. one day till noon the following day, and then we gave people a break, and then we repeated the closed loop from 6 p.m. to noon the following day. And the only difference here was that the dinner meals preceding these 2 18-hour periods of closed loop control were different. They had identical carbohydrate content and protein to the gram. The only difference was that one meal was high fat, 50 grams of fat, the other was 10 grams of fat. So with this experimental design, what we were looking to address is what was the difference in that fat intake having on the impact on their glucoses as well on their insulin requirements, and that's what's shown on this next slide. So if you see the top panel here shows the glucose levels during this 18-hour period of closed-loop control. The bottom panel shows you the insulin delivery by the closed-loop system. Green there is HFD, so that's the glucose is following the high-fat dinner. LFD is the low-fat dinner. And if you look here at the left, you can see, so this is identical carbohydrates, identical protein. The only difference is the actual fat content of those 2 dinner meals. And you can see the glucoses were considerably higher after the high-fat dinner. Despite the fact that, as shown in the bottom panel, the closed-loop system was giving these people more insulin. Now, what was surprising to me and actually a bit unexpected is I thought from clinical experience and seeing what my wife goes through that the glucoses would be higher right through the overnight period, but you can see that wasn't actually the case. The glucoses during the overnight period were similar, and at breakfast they were also similar. So it was just around the dinner meal that we were seeing this. Now, the big practical challenge that comes out of this is the fact that the actual effect of fat on people's insulin requirements was markedly different. And this is what makes translation of these insights into practice very, very challenging. So what's shown up here, what I've calculated here, is looking at the carbohydrates that were consumed during the evening period, how much insulin the closed-loop system was giving to these individuals. I've calculated out what the insulin to carbohydrate ratio for that particular meal would be based on that data. So for every individual, you have the carbohydrate insulin ratio calculated from the low-fat dinner, LFD, and the high-fat dinner. And what you can see is clearly shown here is they're markedly different. I mean, here's a person whose insulin requirements with the high-fat meal went up over 2-fold. 108%, a lot of variability, but I think what this sort of speaks to is that just there's no optimal insulin to carb ratio, because if you calculate the insulin to carb ratio based on a high-fat meal versus a low-fat meal, as clearly shown here, the results come out completely differently. So this makes life rather difficult for people with diabetes. So that's the fat story. Since we did that work, there's been some studies coming out looking at the effect of protein. So this is from a group in Australia who I've been collaborating with, and what they did in this particular study here is they gave people with type 1 diabetes 8 different test strings, no insulin, and you can see a range of different protein content in these different test strings, and they also gave them some glucose loads. So the interesting data is shown here in blue. This is 20 grams of carbohydrate without any insulin. You can see the glucose going up 3 to 4 millimoles, so that's about 55 to 70 milligrams per DL. It shoots way up there. What you can also see there is that 75 grams and 100 grams of protein have an equivalent glucose raising effect as the 20 grams of glucose. The only challenge here, as you can see, this is kicking in 2, 3, 4 hours later. So from a practical standpoint, even though one with higher protein loads, one needs to give insulin, if you're someone who's on MDI, you either need to take regular insulin or take Humalog an hour into the meal to cover the protein, or for someone who's in a pump, obviously the solution here when it comes to covering higher protein meals is to actually do a square wave and an extended bolus. Now the story gets even more complicated when you look at protein together with carbohydrates. So this is actually a study which was just published by the same group this past month. And what they did in this particular study is they again gave people this whole series of different test strings. In this case, all the test strings had 20 grams of carbohydrate, but they varied the amount of protein with the test strings. And in this particular study, they actually gave them insulin. So if you look at the bottom here, 20 grams of carbohydrate with bolus, and the glucose has come way down. But what's interesting here, 20 grams of carbohydrate with as little as 12.5 grams of protein. So that's half an ounce, and you can see the glucoses are higher. But you can see with 75 grams of protein and 20 grams of carbs, the protein has a huge impact on people's glucoses over and above what the 20 grams of carbohydrate alone does. So even more complicated. The obvious question here is you have a more complex meal with extra protein and fat. How are you going to bolus for this? And this is a study which we did to get some insights into this, to sort of address this particular question. So what we did in this particular study, people with type 1 diabetes who came into clinical research center, and what's shown here is the baseline test meal we gave them, so which was basically just the pizza base with marinara sauce. So pure carbohydrates, no cheese there. And we bolus people using their usual insulin-to-carb ratios. You can see the glucose is coming nicely into range. That's at 360 minutes, so we followed them for 6 hours. Then we brought them in for a subsequent visit. The only difference here was we identical carb load, but we added on protein and fat, identical insulin dose, and look at the difference in their glucoses at 6 hours. With the cheese added to the carbohydrate base, you're seeing a glucose difference of over 100 milligrams per deciliter. And I think one of the things I'd point out here is the fact that you can see this is only happening occurring at about 180 minutes onwards. And I think one of the reasons why this has tended to be overlooked in the past is the fact that with a lot of studies and even in practice, one's not looking as far out in terms of the impact. I mean, for many people, this is the overnight period, obviously, after a higher fat meal in the evening. So the next thing we did, my collaborator, Gary Stahl, who's an algorithm engineer, is he took the data and he modeled it using the algorithms that are used in closed-loop systems to come up with an optimized insulin dose. And then we brought people into the clinical research center and gave them that dose. So we had a protocol with repeated dosing until we actually got the dose right and got the glucoses into range. So what's shown here in green here is the glucose levels with the model predicted the optimized insulin dose. You can see they're nicely in range. And so the question is, how much additional insulin did we need to do to get the purple down to the green there to actually get people's glucoses into range? And this is the data. So on average, the insulin dose needed to be increased 65% over and above the dose that was calculated based on the carb content in people's insulin-to-carb ratio. But you can see the challenging issue here, a huge amount of variability among different individuals about how much additional insulin is needed for the fat. So anywhere from 17 up to 124%. I should mention this person with 124% was the same person who's in the closed-loop study who needed 108% on that study. So there's some concordance there. And then we had these are all people on pumps. So we actually had to give a combination bolus extended on average out to 2.4 hours, but you can see the range was 2 to 3 hours. And on average, the split was 30% of the bolus up front and 70% extended out over that 2.5 hour period. But you can see, as shown there again, a huge amount of variability in how much insulin needed to be given up front relative to the extended bolus. So I think the challenge here really is this marked variability between individuals. And unfortunately, we don't really have a good answer in terms of what underlies that because we haven't studied enough people. What I can say is the people who needed the least increase were all people who were avid runners, and so were aerobically very fit. And there is some data showing that people who are aerobically fit can actually metabolize, can break down free fatty acids more effectively, but we don't have an answer. I think the big question here is, the study shows that in this particular study, 30 plus grams of fat, we see an increase in insulin requirements. Well, if a person has 60 grams of fat, is their insulin requirements going to double? Who knows? Is it just a matter of reaching a threshold where you go above a certain amount of fat in a meal and your insulin requirements go up a certain amount and that's it? So again, we don't have any answers. And the other issue really has to do with fat type. So the data suggests that it's primarily saturated fat. So fats that would be in dairy products, meat products that actually cause insulin resistance. I mean, one unanswered question really has to do with whether so-called healthy fats, monounsaturated fats, like olive oil, will have a similar effect. We've got some preliminary data suggesting that with monounsaturated fats, you're not likely to see as much of an effect on insulin sensitivity. So insulin requirements won't change as much, but the effect is primarily in terms of delaying the emptying of the stomach. So the issue there would be with olive oil is that the stomach emptying gets delayed, so the carbohydrates come in later, but you don't need as much of an increase in the actual insulin dose. And then, as with the protein work, I mean, does the amount of carbohydrate mixed in the fat matter? So, where to start? I mean, just some basic recommendations here that you could consider following. But as I mentioned, we still don't know with any certainty around this. I would suggest that when it comes to high-fat meal is to, rather than go, the average in our study said 65% is because some individuals needed much less, is to start cautiously. Just increase the total dose by 30% over and above the carb-calculated bolus. As shown in our studies, you can deliver that over 2 to 3 hours. And then how you actually deliver that bolus is going to depend on what the carbohydrate is. I, in practice, suggest to patients of mine that they just do 50% up front and then do 50% over 2 hours. But obviously, it's going to be a matter of real trial and error here to see what is actually best. What I would highlight here is the fact that there is some data in people without diabetes showing that aerobic exercise will actually blunt the effect of free fatty acids or fat on insulin sensitivity. So if you're going to have pizza in the evening after going out for a run in the afternoon, I would say don't increase your insulin dose as much, simply because of this exercise effect. And then I think the other big one, following on Dr. Pettis' comments yesterday about pizza and beer, if it's going to be pizza and beer, the alcohol will actually neutralize the fat effect, so you don't need to increase the dose as much. What we actually haven't discussed, I mean, I was actually going to speak to Jeremy about is actually we need to come up with a fat alcohol neutralization index. So the idea would be that for every slice of pizza you have 8 ounces of beer, because the alcohol is going to suppress glucose production by the liver. That's going to counteract the fat effect. So that's coming soon. We still have to get grant funding for that but I think the bottom line with this is as I said, is because there's so much into individual variability here. It's just a matter of reevaluating. And I would say there, start cautious with any dosing increase. I think the other aspect of this work, which I think has a lot of relevance, is that when it comes to actually looking at your glucose patterns, if you're seeing unexpected highs, look at what you're eating to see whether it may be some higher fat foods, which you could avoid, which are impacting on your glucoses. So particularly for, if you're having high fastings or high glucoses overnight and it's a bit puzzling, I would look back to the meal, because a lot of people actually just some changes in their food choices can actually have a huge impact when it comes to eliminating these high-fat choices that are impacting on their glucoses. So with that, just want to acknowledge all my colleagues who work with me on this research. Thank you.